The countdown reached 0 with mechanical precision, and Captain Morrison's response came with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout the entire diplomatic mission. His voice carried across the communication channels to every ship in the system, human and alien alike, with words that would be remembered long after the events at Centauri were finished. General Thokmar, humanity offered you peace and you chose war. We offered you cooperation, and you chose conquest. Now you will learn why Earth spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing, while your species grew soft, believing that advanced technology could replace the warrior's heart. The first indication that something was wrong came when the Liberty's edge began to change. What the aliens had mistaken for simple metal plating started retracting along predetermined lines, revealing hull sections that looked nothing like the primitive human technology they expected. Instead of crude armor, they saw layers of reactive plating designed to deflect energy weapons and kinetic projectiles with equal effectiveness. Lieutenant Sullivan's fingers moved across her tactical console with the precision of a concert pianist, bringing online systems that had been carefully hidden from alien sensors for months. The ship's true nature began to reveal itself as weapon ports opened along its hull, and defensive systems activated with the smooth efficiency of machinery designed for one purpose only. The Kraken fleet reacted with the kind of confusion that comes from encountering something completely outside their experience. Their sensors were detecting energy signatures that didn't match any known technology, and the human ship's movements were unlike anything they had seen before. Instead of the lumbering predictability of normal capital ships, the Liberty's Edge moved like a fighter craft, using thrust vectors and gravity manipulation that made it nearly impossible to target. Paul Martinez, working from the engineering section, brought the ship's hybrid power systems online with a surge of energy that lit up sensors throughout the system. The human vessel wasn't using simple fusion reactors as the aliens had assumed, but a combination of technologies that Earth's scientists had developed specifically for this mission. Matter conversion, zero-point extraction, and controlled singularity manipulation provided power levels that rivaled anything in the galaxy. But the real surprise came when the ship's primary weapon systems revealed themselves. Chief Petty Officer Danny Rodriguez, manning the main gun control station, activated the magnetic rail cannons that represented humanity's answer to energy-based warfare. While alien civilizations had focused on plasma weapons and particle beams that could be deflected by shields, humans had perfected the art of throwing solid objects at targets with devastating effect. The first shot came without warning or announcement. A tungsten penetrator rod, accelerated to 30% of light speed by magnetic fields that could have powered a small city, struck the Void Crusher amidships with the force of a nuclear weapon. The projectile punched through the Kraken ship's shields as if they didn't exist, passed through its armor plating like it was made of paper, and created a tunnel of destruction that ran the entire length of the massive vessel. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Void Crusher, pride of the Kraken fleet and symbol of their military dominance, broke apart along structural lines that had been weakened by the kinetic impact. Secondary explosions rippled through its hull as power systems overloaded and ammunition magazines detonated. Within seconds, the massive dreadnought was nothing more than expanding debris and dying energy fields. General Thokmar's final transmission was cut short by the destruction of his flagship, but his last words carried across the fleet communication channels with the kind of stunned disbelief that comes from watching the impossible become reality. The mighty Kraken Dominion, conqueror of star systems and destroyer of civilizations, had just lost their most powerful warship to a species they considered primitive. The response from the remaining Kraken ships was immediate but uncoordinated. 11 dreadnoughts opened fire simultaneously with every weapon they possessed, filling space around the human vessel with enough energy to sterilize entire planets. Plasma cannons discharged their fury while particle beams carved through the void with the power to crack continents. None of it touched the Liberty's Edge. Commander Peterson, coordinating the ship's defensive systems, demonstrated why human military doctrine emphasized mobility over brute force. The ship's movement patterns were based on combat techniques developed during centuries of warfare between highly maneuverable opponents, and the alien weapons simply couldn't track something that moved with such unpredictable efficiency. The Human vessel danced between the incoming fire like a leaf in a hurricane, using gravity manipulation and chemical thrusters to change direction in ways that violated every assumption the aliens had made about space combat. Where alien ships were designed to absorb damage and overwhelm opponents with superior firepower, the human approach was to avoid being hit while delivering precise strikes against critical targets. Lieutenant Colonel Baker, monitoring the battle from the ship's Combat Information Center, watched with professional satisfaction as the engagement unfolded exactly according to Earth's strategic planning. The aliens were fighting the kind of war they understood, massive fleets exchanging, devastating firepower in set-piece battles that could last for days. Humans were fighting the kind of war they had perfected, quick strikes against vital targets followed by rapid repositioning to avoid retaliation. The second Kraken ship died when Rodriguez put a penetrator through its power core, causing a matter-antimatter explosion that turned the dreadnought into a brief new star. The third ship lost its command section to a precisely placed shot that left the rest of the vessel intact, but completely helpless. The fourth ship simply vanished when a kinetic projectile traveling at relativistic speed hit its hyperspace generator and created a dimensional rift that swallowed the entire vessel. Dr. Foster, recording everything for later analysis, realized that they were witnessing the collision between two completely different approaches to warfare. The aliens fought with the assumption that advanced technology would always triumph over primitive weapons, while humans had learned that the most sophisticated defenses could be overcome by applying simple physics with sufficient violence. The Kraken fleet, which had seemed invincible just minutes before, was being systematically destroyed by a single human ship using weapons that were theoretically inferior to everything in their arsenal. The psychological impact on the surviving alien crews was devastating, as they watched their supposedly impregnable vessels being torn apart by projectiles that should have been obsolete. By the time the Liberty's Edge ceased firing, 7 of the 12 Kraken dreadnoughts had been completely destroyed. 3 more were crippled beyond repair, and the remaining 2 were desperately trying to escape the system. The battle had lasted less than an hour, and the outcome had never been in doubt once the humans revealed their true capabilities. The aliens watching from the trade station could barely comprehend what they had witnessed. The mighty Kraken Dominion, which had terrorized the galaxy for generations, had been broken by a species that most of them still considered primitive. The implications were staggering, and it would take time for the full impact to be understood. Captain Morrison's voice once again filled the communication channels, but this time, his words carried the weight of absolute authority backed by demonstrated power. "This is Captain Morrison to all vessels in the Centauri system. The Kraken aggression has been terminated. All prisoners will be released immediately, and any ship attempting to flee will be considered hostile. Humanity seeks peace, but we will not tolerate those who choose to threaten innocent beings." The silence that followed was broken only by the static from destroyed Kraken ships and the quiet acknowledgments from alien vessels that were suddenly very eager to cooperate with their new human allies. The aftermath of the battle brought a silence to the Centauri system that was more profound than the vacuum of space itself. Where moments before there had been the confident chatter of Kraken military communications and the terrified whispers of captured alien crews, now there was only the static from destroyed ships and the careful, respectful transmissions of beings who had just witnessed the impossible. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the Liberty's Edge, watching as the surviving Kraken vessels attempted to flee the system. The 2 remaining dreadnoughts were moving, as quickly as their massive engines could propel them, desperate to escape before the human ship could finish what it had started. Their retreat was disorganized and panicked, nothing like the disciplined formation that had arrived with such confidence. Commander Peterson tracked their movement with the detached professionalism of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this situation. The fleeing ships were damaged and demoralized, but they still represented a threat to civilian populations throughout the galaxy. Earth's instructions had been clear about allowing aggressive forces to escape and regroup. "Danny, put a warning shot across the bow of the lead ship," Morrison ordered. "If they don't stop immediately, disable their engines." Rodriguez adjusted his targeting systems and fired a single penetrator that passed within a few hundred meters of the fleeing dreadnought's command section. The kinetic projectile, traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, created a brilliant streak of ionized particles that was visible to every sensor in the system. The message was unmistakable, and the Kraken ship's engines shut down. Within seconds, the second vessel, witnessing the fate of its companion, followed suit without requiring additional persuasion. Both ships drifted powerless in space, their crews undoubtedly wondering what fate awaited them at the hands of the species they had so recently dismissed as primitive. Throughout the trade station, alien beings who had been preparing for capture or death were slowly beginning to understand that their situation had changed dramatically. The Kraken boarding parties, suddenly cut off from their fleet and facing the prospect of human intervention, were surrendering to station security with a speed that would have been comical under different circumstances. Ambassador Carter, who had spent days being ignored and dismissed by the galactic powers, found herself at the center of urgent diplomatic communications from every species in the system. The same aliens who had questioned humanity's right to join galactic civilization were now desperately eager to establish formal relations with Earth's representatives. Brextar, the Zolonian administrator who had treated the humans with such condescension, approached Carter with the kind of nervous respect usually reserved for dangerous predators. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by a careful politeness that acknowledged the new reality of galactic politics. Ambassador Carter, the Zolonian Empire wishes to express our gratitude for humanity's intervention in this crisis. We would be honored to discuss formal diplomatic relations and potential cooperation between our species. Carter's response was gracious but carried an underlying firmness that hadn't been there during their earlier meetings. The human government is always interested in peaceful cooperation with civilized species. We look forward to productive discussions about mutual interests and shared goals. The careful emphasis on the word civilized was not lost on Brextar, who understood that humanity had just demonstrated their definition of acceptable behavior in very concrete terms. Dr. Foster, meanwhile, was being approached by alien scientists and engineers who were desperate to understand how human technology had proven so effective against supposedly superior Kraken defenses. Their questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of human military philosophy that went beyond simple technological differences. Your kinetic weapons appear to be based on primitive physical principles, one ethereal researcher observed, yet they proved more effective than our most advanced energy systems. How is this possible? Foster's explanation was educational for aliens who had spent centuries believing that technological complexity was equivalent to military effectiveness. Human weapons are designed to solve specific problems rather than demonstrate technological sophistication. Sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective one, especially when your opponent isn't prepared for it. The broader implications were becoming clear to military observers throughout the galaxy. The Kraken Dominion's downfall hadn't been due to inferior technology, but to tactical assumptions that had proven disastrously wrong. They had prepared to fight other civilized species using established rules of engagement, not humans who approached. Warfare is a problem to be solved with maximum efficiency. Lieutenant Colonel Baker was discovering this firsthand as he led teams aboard the disabled Kraken vessels to secure prisoners and gather intelligence. His Marines moved through the alien ships with the kind of controlled aggression that made it clear they were prepared for continued resistance. But the Kraken crews offered no opposition. The alien warriors, who had built their reputation on intimidating lesser species, found themselves face to face with humans who treated combat as a professional skill rather than a tool for bullying. The difference was profound and immediately obvious to anyone who understood military psychology. Paul Martinez was working with alien engineers to restore power and life support to damaged sections of the trade station, and his approach to problem solving was attracting considerable attention. Where alien technology relied on complex automated systems that required specialized knowledge to repair, human engineering emphasized adaptability and field maintenance that could be performed under combat conditions. Your systems appear to be designed for battlefield conditions, one Zolonian technician observed. Most civilized species build equipment for optimal performance under ideal circumstances. Martinez's response reflected a philosophy that was foreign to beings who had enjoyed centuries of peace. Human equipment is designed to work when everything else is falling apart, because that's usually when you need it most. As reports flowed, And from throughout the galaxy, it became clear that the Kraken coup attempt had been more extensive than anyone had realized. Strike forces had attacked key installations in dozens of systems, and only the sudden collapse of their command structure had prevented complete success. The destruction of their fleet at Centauri had left Kraken forces throughout the galaxy, isolated and vulnerable. Captain Morrison received updates on these developments while coordinating with local authorities to restore order to the trade station. The human intervention had prevented a galactic catastrophe, but the work of rebuilding would require continued cooperation between species that were still adjusting to new realities. The formal diplomatic sessions that followed were unlike anything in galactic history. Ambassador Carter found herself negotiating from a position of strength that no human representative had ever enjoyed, while alien diplomats competed to offer favorable terms for trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. The question of human membership in the Galactic Trade Consortium was resolved without debate, though the terms of that membership reflected humanity's new status as a major power rather than a petitioning client state. Earth would have full voting rights, access to all trade routes, and the kind of respect that came from demonstrated capability rather than polite tolerance. More importantly, the galaxy had learned that humanity's offer of peaceful cooperation came with an implicit understanding about the consequences of aggression. The wreckage of the Kraken fleet served as a permanent reminder that Earth's children had not forgotten the lessons their ancestors had learned during millennia of warfare. As the Liberty's Edge prepared to depart Centauri with the first formal treaties between Earth and the galactic powers, Morrison reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. Humanity had arrived as supplicants seeking acceptance and was leaving as partners in shaping the future of galactic civilization. The aliens had questioned humanity's lone ship and received an answer that would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. Sometimes the most important diplomatic messages were delivered not through words but through actions that spoke louder than any speech ever could. The Kraken fleet arrived like a storm front moving across the stars. 12 massive dreadnoughts dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their dark hulls bristling with weapon emplacements that gleamed under the light of the Centauri system's triple suns. Each ship was over 2 miles long and built like a fortress with thick armor plating and energy shields that made space itself shimmer around them. Captain Morrison watched from the Liberty's Edge as the alien vessels took up positions around the trade hub. The Kraken ships moved with deliberate slowness, broadcasting their power to everyone in the system. Their formation was designed to look impressive rather than tactically sound, but Morrison had to admit it was effective at intimidating anyone who might be thinking about resistance. General Thokmar's voice boomed across all communication channels as his flagship, the Void Crusher, positioned itself directly in front of the main station. The massive vessel was a monument to Kraken engineering, with weapon batteries that could level cities and armor thick enough to withstand direct hits from planet-killing weapons. At least, that was what everyone in the galaxy believed. Citizens of the Centauri Trade Hub, you are now under the protection of the Kraken Dominion. All vessels will submit to immediate inspection and registration. Any ship that attempts to leave the system without proper authorization will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. The response from the various alien species was exactly what Thokmar had expected. Ships that had been preparing to depart quickly shut down their engines and waited for instructions. The Zilonian vessels, despite their advanced technology, made no move to resist. The other species followed suit, recognizing that resistance would be futile against such overwhelming force. What none of them realized was that this had been planned from the beginning. The dispute over the Vega system was just an excuse for the Kraken Dominion to position their fleet where it could seize control of the galaxy's most important trade hub. With the Centauri station under their control, they could dictate terms to every other species and establish themselves as the dominant power in the galaxy. Ambassador Carter watched in horror as Kraken boarding parties began moving from ship to ship, systematically taking control of every vessel in the system. The process was conducted with military efficiency, and it was clear that this operation had been rehearsed many times. Within hours, the Kraken forces had effective control of the entire station and everyone on it. The alien crews submitted without significant resistance, which was exactly what the Krakens were counting on. Centuries of peaceful coexistence had made the galactic species soft, unprepared for the kind of brutal aggression that the Kraken military represented. Their advanced weapons and defensive systems were useless if they lacked the will to use them effectively. Dr. Foster, still monitoring alien communications, began to understand the full scope of what was happening. The Kraken forces weren't just seizing the trade hub, they were systematically capturing or destroying the leadership of every major galactic power. The ethereal fleet that was supposed to meet them in the Vega system had been ambushed and scattered. Zolonian command ships throughout the galaxy were being hunted down by Kraken strike forces. This wasn't just a military operation. It was a carefully planned coup designed to decapitate galactic civilization in a single coordinated strike. Within days, the Kraken Dominion would control the major trade routes, the important resource systems, and the political infrastructure that held the galaxy together. Lieutenant Colonel Baker, preparing his Marines for what seemed like inevitable capture, couldn't help but admire the tactical planning involved. The Krakens had identified the weakness of a civilization that had grown too comfortable with peace, and exploited it perfectly. They understood that overwhelming force applied quickly could accomplish more than years of conventional warfare. What they didn't understand was that not every species in the galaxy had grown soft during the long peace. The Kraken boarding schedule was methodical and predictable. They started with the largest ships and worked their way down to smaller vessels, processing each one according to a checklist that had clearly been developed through extensive practice. The human ship, being both small and considered unimportant, was scheduled for inspection near the end of the process. Commander Peterson used the time to make final preparations that would have been obvious to anyone who understood human military doctrine, but were invisible to aliens who had never seen real warfare. The Liberty's Edge underwent what appeared to be routine maintenance, with crew members moving equipment and conducting system checks that looked completely normal to casual observers. Paul Martinez worked with quiet efficiency to bring all of the ship's systems online while maintaining the appearance of a vessel in standby mode. The reactor output was carefully masked, the weapon systems appeared to be powered down, and the defensive system showed no activity on any sensors the aliens might be using to monitor them. The breakthrough moment came when the Kraken forces made their first serious mistake. A squadron of their fighters moved to destroy a small cargo vessel that had attempted to flee the system. The attack was carried out with casual brutality, using far more firepower than necessary to obliterate a ship that posed no threat to anyone. The message was clear to everyone watching. The Kraken Dominion wasn't interested in taking prisoners or following the civilized rules of warfare that had governed galactic conflicts for centuries. They were prepared to use unlimited violence to achieve their goals, and anyone who opposed them would be destroyed without mercy. As the debris from the cargo ship spread across space, Captain Morrison made his final decision. Earth had sent them to the galaxy with specific instructions about when and how to reveal humanity's true capabilities. The systematic destruction of galactic civilization and the murder of innocent civilians had just triggered those conditions. Void Crusher began moving toward the Liberty's Edge with the ponderous confidence of a predator approaching helpless prey. General Thokmar himself opened a communication channel to deliver what he clearly expected to be humanity's surrender. Human vessel, you will prepare for immediate boarding. Your crew will be processed according to Kraken military protocols, and your ship will be impounded pending determination of its value to the Dominion. You have 60 seconds to acknowledge compliance or face destruction. Morrison looked around his bridge at the crew members who had trained their entire lives for this moment. Every person on the ship knew what they were about to do and understood the risks involved. They also knew that failure wasn't an option, because there was nowhere left to run and no one else capable of standing up to the Kraken forces. General Thokmar, Morrison said calmly, I have a counter-proposal. You have exactly 60 seconds to withdraw your forces from this system and release all prisoners, or face the consequences. This is your only warning. The response from the Kraken fleet was immediate and predictable. Laughter echoed across the communication channels as alien crews realized that the primitive humans were actually trying to threaten them. The idea that a single human ship could pose any danger to their massive fleet seemed so absurd that some of the Kraken officers were having trouble believing they had heard correctly. General Thokmar's voice carried amusement and contempt in equal measure. "Humans, your courage is admirable, but your grasp of reality is clearly limited. Observe the power you are attempting to challenge and reconsider your position." The Void Crusher's main guns began charging with a sound like thunder rolling across the void. Energy readings that would have powered entire cities for weeks built up in the massive weapon systems, preparing to deliver a demonstration of Kraken firepower that would reduce the human ship to its component atoms. 60 seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness as the two fleets faced each other across the darkness of space. On one side, the mightiest military force the galaxy had ever seen, confident in their overwhelming superiority and certain of victory. On the other side, a single human ship with crew members who understood that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to demonstrate the true cost of war. The main diplomatic hall of the Centauri trade hub was an impressive sight that made even the most experienced human diplomats feel small. The chamber rose hundreds of feet above them with balconies and platforms arranged in complex patterns that somehow managed to give every species a view of the central speaking area. Ambassador Lisa Carter stood at the designated human platform, which was positioned so far from the center that she needed amplification just to be heard. The morning course session had been devoted to trade negotiations between the major powers, and Carter had watched with growing frustration as humanity was completely ignored. When she finally was given permission to speak, the reaction from the assembled aliens was exactly what she had feared. Polite attention that barely concealed amusement and dismissal. Her presentation about human capabilities and potential contributions to galactic society was met with what could only be described as patronizing applause. Frextar, representing the Zolonian Empire, stood to respond with words that cut deeper than any insult. The human delegation speaks of their species' achievements with admirable enthusiasm. However, we must consider the reality of their technological development. They have barely managed to leave their own solar system, and their fastest ships require weeks to travel distances that modern civilizations cover in hours. A ripple of what sounded like laughter passed through the assembly. Frextar continued with the confidence of someone stating obvious facts. Their energy production is still based on primitive fusion reactors, their weapons technology relies on chemical propellants, and their computing systems use crude silicon-based processors. While we appreciate their desire to join the galactic community, membership in the consortium requires capabilities that humanity simply does not possess. The Kraken representative, General Thokmar, rose from his platform with movements that made it clear he was used to commanding attention through size and intimidation rather than intelligence. His species was built like living tanks, with thick, armor-like skin and muscles that bulged even under their formal diplomatic clothing. The Zolonians speak truly, though they are too polite to state the obvious conclusion. Humanity is not ready for galactic civilization. Their homeworld still suffers from wars, poverty, and environmental destruction. How can beings who cannot manage their own planet contribute to the management of galactic affairs? Thokmar's tone carried the kind of casual cruelty that came from someone who had never been seriously challenged. Perhaps in a few centuries, when they have matured as a species and developed proper technology, we might reconsider their application. Until then, they should focus on solving their local problems and leave galactic matters to those capable of handling them. Carter felt her face flush with anger, but forced herself to remain calm. Getting emotional would only confirm their opinion of human primitiveness. Instead, she smiled politely and thanked the assembly for their consideration, though she noticed that several of the alien representatives had already stopped paying attention and were conducting their own conversations. Dr. Ryan Foster, watching from the human section, was taking detailed notes, not just on what was being said, but on the technology being casually displayed around the chamber. The Zolonians were using holographic displays that seemed to exist in midair without any visible projectors. The ethereal collective members communicated through devices that appeared to read their thoughts directly. Even the simplest alien gadgets showed capabilities that Earth science was only beginning to understand. What Foster found most interesting, however, was what the aliens weren't showing. Despite all their advanced technology, he noticed that their security systems were surprisingly basic. The weapons carried by the guards were clearly designed for show rather than effectiveness, and the defensive systems he could observe seemed built for dealing with civil unrest rather than serious military threats. Meanwhile, Commander Amy Peterson was conducting her own observations from a different angle. As the Liberty's Edge's first officer, she was trained to assess military capabilities, and what she was seeing made her increasingly confident about their mission. The various alien species had clearly been at peace for so long that they had forgotten what real warfare looked like. Their ship designs prioritized comfort and efficiency over combat capability. Even the Kraken vessels, which were meant to be, their military force seemed designed more for intimidating civilians than fighting other warships. Their weapons were powerful but slow. Their shields were impressive but had obvious weak points, and their tactical formations suggested they had never faced an opponent who could actually fight back effectively. The afternoon session brought news that would change everything, though none of the aliens seemed to realize it yet. A dispute had been brewing between the Kraken Dominion and the Ethereal Collective over mining rights in the Vega system, and the tension was finally reaching a breaking point. General Thokmar stood to address the assembly with words that carried the weight of an ultimatum. The Ethereal Collective has had sufficient time to consider our reasonable request for joint administration of the Vega mining facilities. Their continued refusal to cooperate leaves us no choice but to pursue other options. The ethereal representative, a being that seemed to be made of shifting light and shadow, responded in a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The Kraken Dominion mistakes patience for weakness and cooperation for submission. The Vega system has been under ethereal protection for 3 centuries, and we will not abandon our responsibilities because of threats from those who measure worth only in terms of military strength. The exchange that followed made it clear that both sides were preparing for conflict. The Kraken fleet was already moving toward the disputed system, while the ethereal forces were mobilizing their own ships in response. Other species began choosing sides or declaring neutrality, and the careful balance of galactic politics started to crumble. Through it all, the human delegation was completely ignored. Their opinions weren't sought. Their offer to mediate was dismissed without consideration, and their very presence seemed to be forgotten as the great powers focused on more important matters. Carter watched the proceedings with growing concern, not because she feared for humanity's safety, but because she could see how this conflict was going to develop. The aliens were treating it like a chess game, moving pieces around according to rules they had established over centuries of civilized warfare. They had no idea that someone was about to change the rules entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Baker, monitoring the situation from the Liberty's Edge, began making quiet preparations that none of the alien observers would recognize as military activity. His Marine contingent started conducting what appeared to be routine equipment checks, while the ship's weapon systems underwent standard maintenance procedures that happened to leave them fully armed and ready for action. The day ended with both sides issuing formal statements that were really just polite declarations of war. The Kraken fleet would arrive in the Vega system within 48 hours, and the ethereal forces would be waiting for them. Everyone expected a brief conflict that would be resolved according to the established rules of galactic warfare. No one was paying attention to the small human ship in Docking Bay 743, where Captain Morrison was reviewing tactical assessments and making final preparations for a demonstration that would shock the galaxy into a new understanding of what humanity was really capable of accomplishing. The Liberty's Edge dropped out of hyperspace with a flash of blue light that quickly faded into the darkness of space. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge watching the massive structure that filled their forward screen. The Centauri trade hub stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, its metal towers and docking bays gleaming under the light of 3 different suns. Ships of every shape and size moved around it like insects around a hive. Morrison had seen many things in his 30 years of service, but nothing quite like this. The station was bigger than some of Earth's cities and clearly built by beings with technology far beyond human capabilities. Energy fields shimmered around its outer sections and strange lights pulsed along its surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan turned from her console with a frown on her face. Her tactical systems were picking up energy signatures from at least 50 different ship designs, most of which didn't match anything in their databases. Some of the vessels were smooth and flowing like liquid metal, while others looked like they had been grown rather than built. A few were simple geometric shapes that somehow managed to move through space without any visible engines. The communication system crackled to life with a voice that sounded like it was being filtered through broken glass. The universal translator worked overtime to convert the alien speech into something resembling English. Unknown vessel, you will identify yourself immediately and state your business at this facility. Morrison stepped forward and activated the response channel. This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earthship Liberty's Edge. We are here on behalf of the human government to establish diplomatic relations with the Galactic Trade Consortium. There was a long pause before the voice returned, now carrying what sounded like amusement. Humans. Yes, we have received word of your species. You will dock at Bay 743 in Sector 12. You are restricted to that area, until further notice. The channel went dead before Morrison could respond. He looked at his crew and saw his own concerns reflected in their faces. Bay 743 was clearly not in the best part of the station. Chief Engineer Paul Martinez pulled up a schematic of the docking assignments and whistled softly. Their assigned bay was in the outermost ring of the station, as far from the main diplomatic areas as possible. As they approached their designated docking bay, Morrison could see that the other ships in their section were small and clearly from less important species. Most looked like cargo haulers or scout vessels, not the sleek warships and massive trade vessels that filled the inner sections of the station. It was obvious they were being treated like unwelcome relatives at a family gathering. The docking process itself was smooth enough, though the alien systems required Paul Martinez to work overtime to make their ship's connections compatible with the station's power and life support systems. The artificial gravity felt strange, lighter than Earth normal but heavier than ship gravity. The air had a metallic taste that their filters couldn't quite remove. Ambassador Lisa Carter gathered her diplomatic team, while Morrison assembled his senior staff. They would be going aboard the station in 2 groups, with the ambassador handling the political side while Morrison's people focused on gathering intelligence about the various alien species and their capabilities. The airlock opened onto a corridor that stretched away in both directions farther than they could see. The walls were made of some kind of metal that seemed to shift color as they moved, and the lighting came from sources they couldn't identify. Alien beings moved past them without giving them more than curious glances, some walking on 2 legs, like humans, while others floated or moved on multiple limbs. A tall, thin creature with blue-gray skin and 4 arms approached them. Its head was elongated and its eyes were much larger than human eyes, giving it an unsettling appearance. When it spoke, its voice was high and musical, though the translator made it sound more normal. I am Brextar, administrator for this section of the station. You will follow the marked paths and remain in designated areas. Your species has been granted limited access, while your request for membership in the consortium is reviewed. Morrison noticed that Vrextar's tone suggested the review was more of a formality than a serious consideration. The alien's body language, even though it was completely different from human body language, somehow conveyed dismissal and barely concealed contempt. They were led through a series of corridors to what was clearly a visitor's area designed for species that weren't considered important enough for the main diplomatic sections. The rooms were comfortable enough but clearly basic compared to what they glimpsed through doorways leading to other parts of the station. As they settled into their assigned quarters, reports began coming in from the crew members who had been allowed to move around their section of the station. Chief Petty Officer Danny Rodriguez had observed the security systems and noted that they seemed designed for crowd control rather than serious defense. The aliens appeared to have grown comfortable with peace and weren't expecting serious threats. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Baker had managed to get a look at some of the alien military personnel and found them surprisingly soft. They carried weapons that looked impressive, but seemed more for show than practical use. Their movements suggested they had never been in real combat, and their equipment appeared designed more for intimidation than effectiveness. Dr. Ryan Foster was having the time of his life cataloging the various alien species, but even he noticed the pattern in how they treated the humans. Every species they encountered seemed to view them as primitive newcomers who might be useful for simple labor, but couldn't possibly contribute anything meaningful to galactic civilization. The attitude became even clearer when they were finally invited to observe a session of the consortium's governing council. They were seated in what amounted to a visitor's gallery, far from the main floor where the real decisions were being made. The various alien representatives barely acknowledged their presence, and when humans were mentioned at all, it was with the kind of tone usually reserved for discussing children or pets. Morrison watched and listened, taking mental notes about the power dynamics between the different species. The Zolonians clearly considered themselves the most advanced, with their energy-based technology and ancient civilization. The Kraken Dominion represented raw military power, though their representatives seemed more interested in intimidation than actual fighting. The ethereal collective spoke in riddles and seemed to consider themselves above the concerns of lesser beings. What none of them seemed to realize was that underestimating humans had historically been a serious mistake. Morrison smiled slightly as he watched the alien politicians posture and argue. They had no idea what Earth had sent them into the galaxy to accomplish, and he intended to keep it that way until the time was right.